Class, welcome back. It is week 15. The film is City Lights, directed by Charlie Chaplin, the one and only 1931. So last week we were in the 20s for Nanook. So we're not. This isn't a film that comes before Nanook. This comes after it. But it made more sense to save this one for this particular spot. Charlie Chaplin. Everybody's heard of Charlie Chaplin, but not everybody's seen a movie by Charlie Chaplin. And when you get into this space, it's actually kind of challenging because, first of all, these are silent films. Most of his films are completely silent. He's got a couple that have elements of the talking of sync sound films. So, for a lot of people, it's a daunting space because they are compared to contemporary entertainment, slower. But if you give them some space, okay. In other words, to watch this film, turn your phone off or put it in your freezer. Right? Put it in the fridge, just get it away from you. Get into a quiet space where you can get the first 30 or 40 minutes without any interruption. If you can do that, the film will grab you, right? You'll slip right in and then you're good. If you are distracted and you're doing other things for the first 20 minutes and you're trying to do two things, it just won't work. The films aren't as intense as what we're used to now. Charlie Chaplin is, without question, one of the greatest directors to ever work in America. He is phenomenally talented. He is a writer, he is a director, and most importantly, he is the performer. And he is an extraordinary performer. So he's got both ends of the spectrum, and he's working like this. It's like as good as you get, right? Okay. A couple of just sort of information things. In filmmaking, there's a thing called a shot ratio, or a shooting ratio. Shot ratio is a ratio that compares the minutes or hours of film shot against the length of the final film. So if you made a documentary, and say you shot 10 hours of footage, and the final film was 1 hour, your shot ratio would be 10 to 1, right? A lot of television commercials have very, very high shot ratios. It can be 100 to 1. There's some documentaries that are 300 to 1. In other words, for every 300 minutes of footage shot, there's only 1 minute in the final film. And this surprises people who've never done this stuff before, but this is really typical. This film, City Lights, has a shot ratio of 39 to 1. Now, what that suggests is that Chaplin was doing a lot of takes and he was doing a lot of work to improve the scenes and get them off the ground. So in other words, imagine 40 minutes of film and only 1 minute gets used and put into the final piece. It means that there was a lot of material created that wasn't used, and it sort of shines some light on his creative process. Okay, you guys, let's talk about studio language. This is in here because I think it's really hard for new filmmakers to figure out how to manage the language they're being given and how that matches against what they're actually doing. In other words, why do we use the words we use in filmmaking and how do they relate to you if you want to actually make something, okay? What are the words, the dominant language of filmmaking? If you talk about the process, is pre-production, production, post-production, okay? You ask a filmmaker, how's it going? What are you doing with your film? They say, well, I'm in production, I'm in pre-production, I'm in post-production. Pre-production is the time when you're getting the film ready. Scripting, storyboarding, all the organizational stuff, getting locations, casting actors, all that's pre-production. Production is when you're actually shooting. That can be a very short amount of time sometimes. Post-production is when you're putting everything together in the edit, sound mixing, sound editing, color correction, everything else, all the outputting. If you talk to someone about the creative process of film, here's what will happen in their brains. Here's an image, okay? You got pre-production, production, post-production, and the language suggests that all three units are equals in terms of effort. This is the first problem. On many, many films, the reality of the labor involved might actually look much more like this. You might have just like a little bit of pre-production, say a week, and then a little bit of production when you're actually shooting. That could be 3 days. Then you might be in post-production for 4 months. That would be totally normal. That wouldn't be surprising at all if that actually happened. So already we see that the language is sort of obscuring the reality of the process, right? Now let's go a little bit farther. If we look at this graph, here's a very common experience, okay? If you look at that top line, you do a little bit of pre-production, and you go into production, And then you go into this 5 beats of post-production, 6, 7, and then you realize like, oh my God, I made a mistake. I need to go back and get some more shots. You have to do some more pre-production to prep that, and then you do more production, and you go back into post-production. And when this happens to people, when they get into this cycle, very often what it feels like is failure. They feel like, oh, I failed. Like I got into post-production and something was missing, and I had to stop everything and go back, and I'm not good at those. That's not true. Now, what's the problem? The problem is the language of film comes from this place right here, and many others just like it. Look at that. See that big block of buildings in the middle? That's a studio. I forgot where I got the picture, but I think that's MGM in the 30s. And what it looks like is it looks like a factory, and in many ways it is. It's a story factory. In those spaces, you've got all kinds of stuff going on. You've got some spaces for shooting, for production. You'd have some facilities for editing. You'd have some facilities for the screenwriters and for the coverage people and for the executives and for all the tool makers. So it is kind of a factory, and that language of pre-production, production, post-production fits perfectly in the reality of that place, right? But this place and those words do not describe the human experience, the human creative experience. Matter of fact, they're terrible at it. So what works better? Well, there's better language. And if you look at the other arts, if you look at musicians and visual artists, and you look at photographers, none of them. Can you imagine a musician saying, I'm in pre-production on my new song, and now I'm in production on my song, and now I'm in post-production on my song? A musician would never talk that way. A painter would never talk that way. A photographer would never talk that way. They have better language. Their language might sound something like this. Like, they might say, oh, I'm prototyping if it's a designer. If they're a visual artist, if they're a painter, they might say, I'm doing studies, right? I'm preparing to do a big painting. They might say iteration or sketch. And all of those words suggest cyclical activity. So here's what the creative process from almost everyone actually looks like. The creative process goes in a cycle, kind of a spiraling. You start with the first idea, and you do another cycle, and you try and improve it, and you try and improve it. And and it feels like you're going in circles, but it's actually very productive. And I like the word prototype. That's my favorite, because prototype covers all the bases, and it suggests that you can do this as many times as you have to until you decide it's done. And that's the important idea for the real creative process for people. Now, I want to show an example real quick of how this works with a real piece of art. Take a look at this painting. This is a painting done in 1942 by a very well-known artist named Ed Hopper. The painting is called Nighthawks. It's got a very noir feel, does it not? Now, most people, if you ask them, how did this painting get created? They say, well, they would imagine a painter in a studio probably with a canvas, it's empty. And they would imagine the artist maybe thinking about it for a while. And then, like a lot of people, they may assume that artists are some form of genius. And then the artist would simply start from inspiration. That's what everybody likes to talk about, is inspiration. And then would execute this painting, and some hours would go by, and the artist would step back and go, there it is, it's done. That can happen, but that's not how this happened. And it's not how you should ever expect anything you make to have happen. When that does happen, it's great. But that's not reliable. What's very reliable is this prototyping process. Now, here's how this painting actually got created. Here is Ed Hopper's first sketch. You can call this, now painters will call these studies sometimes. You call it a sketch, you call it a prototype, it's all the same. Here's the first one. So he's just figuring out the basic geometry, right? It's just rectangles. You know, what's the balance of the painting going to be? Now, the next image is not a continuation. This is not him drawing on the same thing. He puts the first one aside and he starts over. Here's the second prototype. Now you can see him working on some shading here. There's more detail in the windows. There's shadows. And the geometry is improved and refined. Here is the third prototype. Again, a totally separate drawing. It is not a continuation. Now we see people up here. We get more details in the background. And most notably, you start to see the balance of the space inside the cafe or restaurant. Okay, now the fourth one's cool. Look at this. This one, he's trying to figure out, okay, my primary figure in the painting, I only see his back. What does it look like? Where do the shadows fall? What do the clothes look like? If you look at the right shoulders, you can see the muscularity, you can see the anatomy there. You can also see the anatomy in the back and its relationship to the fabric. This is just him working out the details of each little piece of the painting. Now here's the next prototype. Again, a totally separate piece. And this is where it's starting to come together, right? It's by no means finished, but all the basic details are here. We see the people. Now, if you look at the details really carefully, it's cool. The man in the foreground, the main subject, watch how much it changes from here to the final one. Now, here is the final painting. And just look at the polish. Just the incredible precision and polish as he executes the final one. This final piece, the precision of it, the balance of it, would not be possible without all that preparation to figure out all the details of how he's going to execute this. So this is an example of an artist using a prototyping or sketching or iterative style to develop and grow the idea. Inspiration, no. Work, yes. Okay? All right, now you guys enjoy this film, City Lights by Charlie Chaplin. Is, to me, this guy, it's probably one of my 3 favorite films. I just think this is some of the most remarkable stuff ever. It took me a long time to appreciate it, so if it's the first time you're not too sure about it, okay, I accept that. But what's important is try and give the film some space to breathe. Turn your phone off. The film can't compete with your phone. It can't compete with a whole bunch of interference. These are still a little slower. But if you can give a half hour or 40 minutes into it without being disturbed, you're in, you're good. You'll love it, okay? Look at the amazing choreography of a few of the scenes. Look at the boxing match. Look at the spaghetti scene. I mean, this is like as good as it can ever be for this style of performance. Chaplin was an absolute master. This week we have quiz 3, 15 questions down there. The review is down there. Take your time and go through this. This is it. We've done quiz 1, we've done quiz 2, this is quiz 3. If you put them together, it's the final exam, okay? Do quiz 3. Next week, you do the final. The final is all those questions, 45 total questions, all in one batch, okay? Enjoy the film. Break a leg.